Historically, if we go far, enough back in time, I think that a lot of indigenous thinking did view the world as alive, as an animate entity. And then that view became less popular over time within Western science because Western science was really concerned with segregating the animate from the inanimate, really classifying things very specifically. And then there was also kind of the powers of colonization and capitalism that favored this worldview of, the planet having a body of resources, just inanimate resources ready for the taking, not being this massive living entity that was worthy of veneration.
My name is Eva Kornman. I'm an educator here at the Museum of Science, and my guest today is Ferris Jabr, a journalist and New York Times bestselling author of Becoming Earth. We talked about Ferris's journeys from a mile underground to the top of the Amazon rainforest, where he saw how life made Earth and Earth is life. Ferris, thank you so much for being here today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So to kind of get us started, I'm hoping you can just kind of give an overview of the thesis of your book, Becoming Earth.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. So my book explores how life has transformed the planet over the past several billion years, turning it from what was once basically just a rock in space into this vibrant living world that we have today. And it re-examines the notion that Earth itself is alive in some meaningful sense, that it's one big, vast, interconnected living system.
So a really key idea that your book kind of explores and expounds upon is the Gaia hypothesis. So tell me about the Gaia hypothesis and kind of why you are revisiting it now.
Yeah, so the Gaia hypothesis was conceived by a British scientist and inventor named James Lovelock between the 1960s and 80s, and then later he developed it with American biologist Lynn Margulis and others. And it posits that wherever life emerges on a planet, it is going to become integrated with that planet into a single system, and it is going to affect the evolution, the development of that planet over time. And he liked to compare Earth to a redwood tree. So, any giant mature tree is mostly dead. There's only small parts of it that are alive. And it's similar with Earth, which is mostly inanimate rock, water, and air, but is kind of wrapped in this amazing flowering skin of life that supports this much larger living entity in Lovelock's view. And so, he published a book about this called Gaia that was very popular and very controversial. A lot of readers really loved it, but a lot of scientists at the time were not so fond of it.
Why was that? Why was this such a controversial idea? What issues did scientists have with it?
It was particularly evolutionary biologists that did not like the idea of a planet being alive because they had much stricter definitions for what a living thing is. And for them, it's all about, reproduction and natural selection. And planets don't reproduce the way organisms do. They're not going through evolution by natural selection the way organisms do. So they didn't like the idea of, applying the concept of life to something at that scale.
How did you personally kind of find this idea and decide to expand upon it in this work?
For me, the seed of the book was learning about how the Amazon rainforest generates its own rain to a large extent. So it doesn't just passively receive the rain. It actually generates about half of the rain that falls on its canopy each year. And this process involves all of the life in the forest. The trees and plants are pulling huge volumes of water from the soil. They're saturating the air with what they don't use. And at the same time, they're breathing out this bouquet of tiny biological particles like pollen grains, fungal spores, microbes, and all that water vapor and those tiny biological particles combine in the atmosphere, and they really speed up the formation of clouds. And then because the Amazon is so massive, it's affecting weather all throughout the continent of South America, bringing rain to other places, and even contributing to rainfall as far away as Canada and the Pacific Northwest, because the atmosphere is one big interconnected system. So, what happens over here in South America can influence what's happening in Canada.
And just out of curiosity, what brought about your interest in the Amazon rainforest?
Well, at the time, I was learning more broadly about plants and how plants have a lot more agency and intelligence and communication than we typically give them credit for, and this was kind of part of that research. But what it really sort of triggered in me was this curiosity about how life changes its environment in very large and profound ways. So I started searching for other examples similar to the Amazon making its own rain, and I started finding them all over the place. And coming from very diverse fields of science, oceanography, atmospheric science. And I really realized that many of the features of the planet we take for granted, the blue sky, the breathable atmosphere, the existence of fire, fertile soil, all of this was made by life or shaped by life in some way. It wasn't the default state, it wasn't there from the very beginning.
I'm curious kind of why this view of life as something so distinct from Earth. It's almost like Earth is the stage rather than one of its players. Why is this currently such a pervasive view?
Yeah, I mean, historically, if we go far, enough back in time, I think that a lot of indigenous thinking did view the world as alive, as an animate entity. And then that view became less popular over time within Western science because Western science was really concerned with segregating the animate from the inanimate, really classifying things very specifically. And then there was also kind of the powers of colonization and capitalism that favored this worldview of, the planet having a body of resources, just inanimate resources ready for the taking, not being this massive living entity that was worthy of veneration. Even talking about the planet being alive metaphorically became unpopular amongst Western scientists by the time of Darwin and later. But then in the past few decades, and especially since Lovelock, there's been so much new evidence coming to light about how intimately connected life is to all of the geological and chemical processes of the planet, really blurring the line between geology and biology. I mean, there are large parts of our planet that are literally made of ancient life, and so life is continually becoming the planet and then becoming life again in these incredible, cycles and loops. And so now there's this relatively new field of science called Earth system science. And some people see it as the modern evolution of the Gaia hypothesis because it explicitly studies the planet as one big interconnected system where the animate and the inanimate are tightly interconnected and constantly influence each other.
I think really tied up in this whole question is like, what is life, right? And that's been a really difficult definition throughout history. So, why has this been such a difficult question, and what exactly is life? How do we classify it?
Yeah, life is one of those kind of fundamental phenomena like time, space, energy, consciousness, language that we still don't really have a precise definition for. If you open up a biology textbook today, you're still going to see a long list of criteria that presumably distinguish the living from the non-living, but not sort of a single concise sentence that really tells you what life is as a physical phenomenon. And I think that's because we simply don't understand enough about the physics of life to really sum it up very concisely. Scientists and philosophers have been thinking about this for thousands of years and trying. And there's always new theories, new ideas, and we get a little bit of a clearer picture. And, something interesting comes up now and then, but we still don't have that beautiful, precise definition or some, unique set of equations that really tells us what life is. But there's sort of a working definition out there that I've come to favor, kind of going through what many scientists and thinkers have proposed, which is that life is a system that actively sustains itself. So if you think about, living things versus non-living things, like a rock can endure for a very long time, but it's not actively doing anything to keep itself a rock. It's not using energy in that way to maintain itself, which is very different from what living things do. Living things are constantly using energy to maintain this sort of high degree of organization and complexity that otherwise the universe would not want to exist, right? Because everything's moving towards extreme maximum entropy, dissolution. The universe wants, everything to just be this homogeneous mush of energy and matter with no organization or complexity. And living systems resist that temporarily by using energy. So a lot of scientists have focused that, on that as sort of a key feature of living systems.
So then tell me how Earth fits into your working definition of life as something that sustains itself.
Yeah. So the first big revelation for me was to stop thinking about life as something that simply inhabits the planet or exists on the surface of the planet, and to think of it as a literal physical extension of the planet. And I like to make an analogy to a vast beach from which spontaneously emerge all manner of sand castles and sand structures.
Okay.
And if you think about it, like those structures are not divorced from the larger beach just because they're more intricate and complex than just a bunch of sand. They're still literally made of the same grains of sand. They're literally coming out of the beach, right? Well, it's exactly the same with life and Earth, I think. All living things are made of Earth. They come out of Earth. They're made of the raw materials of Earth, and they return to Earth. So I see them now as kind of these literal material extensions of the planet, an expression of the planet. And then all of that life is looping back to profoundly influence the planet's cycles and rhythms, its geology and chemistry. So it really is very intimately connected to the entire planetary system. So in that way, life is not just this surface phenomenon, but it really becomes a planetary expression and a planetary scale phenomenon. And we see that Earth, over vast timescales, 4.5 billion years, demonstrates this incredible resilience and tenacity. Because it's gone through amazing catastrophes, unlike anything humanity's ever experienced. And every single time, not only has it recovered, but it's found a way to flourish again. So, Earth is demonstrating the kind of resilience, maintenance that we associate with living systems at the planetary scale. And, some scientists think that's because life itself is so integral to that resilience, right? It has become so intertwined with these planetary processes. So the planetary system as a whole demonstrates many of the features of smaller living systems. It's got structure, growth, metabolism, a kind of planetary evolution, and this amazing resilience. So it really fits a lot of the defining features of life.
I'm wondering if you could kind of tell me what have been some of the most stunning or eye-opening examples that you found throughout your reporting of how life is shaping Earth and vice versa, how Earth is shaping life?
Well, first I have to say that probably the most profound transformation that the planet underwent was the complete revolution of the atmosphere. So if we go back, more than 3 to 4 billion years ago, there was essentially no oxygen in the atmosphere, and the atmosphere was probably a hazy orange color.
Mm.
And so today we have 21% oxygen and a beautiful blue sky on a clear day. And life is responsible for that transformation because photosynthesis is why we have a breathable atmosphere. When photosynthetic cyanobacteria in the ocean 2.5 billion years ago started to breathe out oxygen into the ocean and atmosphere, they began this long process of slowly oxygenating the atmosphere and changing its chemistry. And that process ended up taking 2 billion years and continued with plants on land. So it was very slow, took a really long time, but the end result was a completely different planet chemically. And, for example, half of the more than 5,000 minerals that we have on this planet require high oxygen levels to exist.
Mm.
So if life had not oxygenated the atmosphere, we wouldn't have such a diverse mineral repertoire. And we wouldn't have, a breathable atmosphere, a blue sky, or the ozone layer that protects life from harmful ultraviolet rays. So it really did change everything and kind of pave the way for more complex life. But another favorite example of mine is the White Cliffs of Dover in the UK. And so this is sort of a massive geological construct of limestone or chalk. And if you chip off a tiny piece of chalk from those cliffs and you look at it under a microscope, you will see, amidst all the jumbled rock, these really intricate rings and arcs that are made of tiny peg-like structures kind of packed together like the stones in a stone archway. And that's because you're looking at the remains of the shells of plankton that lived in the ocean 65 million years ago and encased themselves in these intricate chalky shells. And then when they died, those sank to the sea floor, accumulated in thick layers of sediment, and were subjected to so much heat and pressure that they literally turned to stone. And then later, when sea level shrank, all of that petrified rock was exposed to the air, and that's what the White Cliffs of Dover are. It's literally made of the compacted remains of single-celled ocean plankton that lived millions of years ago.
Wow.
And that turns out to be true for most chalk and limestone formations on our planet, including big sections of the Alp. So, there are huge portions of our planet that are literally made of the ancient remains of life. So life really does become the planet, and then that ends up nurturing future life in really interesting ways. The wind blows over 27 million tons of dust from deserts in Africa to the Amazon rainforest, bringing over nitrogen and phosphorus that fertilize the rainforest. And that dust is also ancient plankton coming from an ancient lake that existed millions of years ago and dried up, and now is helping the Amazon grow today. So these incredible ecological connections that persist through deep time, have really astonished me in writing this book.
It seems like maybe there's the view that Earth was just kind of waiting for life. It had the blue sky, it had the oceans, it had the tides. Everything was just ready and waiting. But you argue that that's not the case at all. Like they grew together almost, right?
Yeah, it's it's a little bit of both because there has to be the right conditions there in the first place for
Mm.
life to emerge. It's true that Earth being the right distance from the sun and kind of having that magnetic cloak that protects it from a lot of cosmic rays and having the presence of liquid water, these are really important sort of prerequisites for the kind of life we have on our planet anyways. But it's also true that life continually made the planet more habitable, and allowed, future waves of more complex life to emerge. So both those things are absolutely happening at the same time.
Something that I'm really struck by is sort of the stunning amount of biodiversity that you cover both in the book and your reporting at large. You make microbes and seaweed seem as important as like elephants and human beings. So I'm curious what draws you to report on such vastly different types of life and, especially given your book's central ideas, why is this such an important thing to learn about?
I mean, I've always been really drawn to nature and, animals, plants, living things in particular from a very young age. Just always really wanted to understand them, how they work. I don't really know where that came from. It was
Okay.
I emerged so early that it just felt like a part of me from the very beginning.
Yeah.
So I was always really interested in the life sciences and just kind of figuring out, what makes biology tick. And what I loved in particular about this subject is it kind of sits at the intersection of so many different sciences. It is very much about life science, but it's also about earth science and geology and chemistry and the current climate crisis. It has a lot to do with that as well. And so that was really appealing to me as a sort of way to write about what really matters right now, because I think that this larger story of life and Earth co-evolving over billions of years really helps us situate what is happening to our planet right now and, what our species in particular has done to the planet.
Any particular standout memories of early interactions with wildlife or biodiversity or any recent really standout
Yeah.
memories?
Well, I grew up in the Bay Area in California, and so going on nature hikes was kind of like built into our public education there. And I had a sort of menagerie of pets growing up, everything from hamsters and rabbits to fire-bellied toads and salamanders and fish and such. So I had a lot of animals and plant life around me all the time. And I've been really fortunate to, experience really amazing parts of our planet's ecology through writing and journalism. I mean, for this book, I went to the heart of the Amazon rainforest. I went to Siberia, where they have an experimental nature park up there. I went a mile beneath the surface of the planet. So I've gotten to see a lot of really unique ecosystems, ranging from intraterrestrial microbes that live a mile down and kind of are coming out of water, gushing out of rock, to Russian scientists trying to change the Siberian permafrost tundra, turn it more into sort of a grassland by importing large herbivores like bison, to a protected region of the Amazon where they have this massive tower that's more than 1,000 feet in the air, and scientists come from all over to climb it and study, the relationship between the forest and the atmosphere.
I'm going to say maybe tell me about some of those in more detail. Honestly, all three.
Yeah.
Choose your favorite and
Well,
start there.
Yeah, the Amazon was especially important to me because it was the seed of the book. And I had to wait about 2.5 years to get to that research station because it was shut down during the pandemic. And so this had this massive research tower there, and when you finally get to it in person, you're kind of standing at the bottom looking up. It's a lot more, intimidating than you even anticipated, and the researchers are very concerned about people not being able to complete the climb either physically or psychologically. So they're
Okay.
constantly asking you, like, are you sure you're okay with heights? Are you sure you can do this? And by the 15th time they've asked you, like, you're not really as confident as you were in the beginning.
Yeah.
But the way it works is there's no elevator or anything, so there's just a giant staircase, in the middle of this metal tower.
Okay.
So you're harnessed to the spiraling railing just in case you slip through one of the many gaps, like you won't actually plummet to your death, you'll just sort of dangle. And so you just walk up this giant staircase, which takes like a couple hours at least because it is so tall,
Wow.
But then you find, and you see the rainforest at different levels as you go, right? So like you're like underneath the trees, then you're like right where the canopy is. And eventually when you get to the top, you're halfway between the clouds and the treetops. So you're seeing the mist, rising off of the forest. You're seeing the clouds forming above you. And at that point, I understood, how much life was involved in that process of making clouds and changing the weather. So it was really special to me, to see all of that in person and get that perspective. And you can see also that the rainforest is this massive living web or network that continues so far that you can't even see its borders. Like it just keeps going as far as you can see. And that, it really brings home just how much life has changed, covered, transformed the planet. And, that when you have an ecosystem as big and interconnected as the Amazon rainforest, of course, it's going to shift things, throughout the planet as a whole, just because of its sheer scale.
Yeah.
And then let's see. So Siberia was very different. There's a pair of Russian scientists there called the Zimovs, and they have this theory that herbivores and grasslands are very intimately interconnected and have shaped each other through evolutionary time, and that if they bring giant herbivores back to the tundra in Siberia, they could perhaps recreate some version of the grasslands that existed there in the Pleistocene tens of thousands of years ago.
Mm.
But doing that is extremely challenging, to bring bison and Yakutian horses and all these other animals that can survive up there from far away takes a lot of effort. It isn't always as successful as they want it to be. But they have managed to sort of transform small regions to more grassland-like areas. But to see, that extremely remote landscape, it took 3 days of travel just to get from the west coast of the U.S. to the research station.
Wow.
So it's a very long trip, a long
Yeah.
way. And you can really see climate change in action there because
Okay.
everything is kind of melting and thawing. The rising temperatures are really breaking apart the frozen soil that's existed there for a long time. There's one area in particular along the riverbank that is just covered in bones of animals from the Pleistocene.
Wow.
And actually, these bones are not technically fossils. They haven't turned to stone the way, dinosaur bones that we're familiar with have. They're just the bones themselves that have been frozen for tens of thousands of years in the permafrost, in the frozen soil.
Crazy.
And you can even find fur sometimes. So they've actually found like mammoth, mastodon fur or bison fur out there. And it's being increasingly exposed because of all the thawing that's going on.
Yeah.
And then I got to go a mile beneath the surface of the planet in South Dakota. So there's a former gold mine there that shut down a long time ago and was converted into a scientific laboratory. And most of the scientists that go there are physicists, and they are using the rock all around them to conduct these really sensitive experiments that need to be shielded from cosmic rays as much as possible.
Mhm.
But I went with biologists, and they go there, to sort of the dankest, dirtiest, wettest corners, and they're looking for life that lives a mile down.
Mm.
And most of that life is microbial. It's these weird bacteria and other microbes that are very different from surface microbes. They don't have as much access to oxygen or light. So they're not getting energy and food in the usual ways. They've learned how to breathe or eat rock and metal that they live in. And some of them change their environments, like they'll extrude little iron corkscrews, that form these deposits of sort of reddish clay, essentially. Or they will sequester sulfur in their cells, so they become a very ghostly white, and then they form these kind of weird pearly strings on the water that looks like, the skin of a poached egg. So they make these really weird subterranean, ecosystems and hotspots.
Were these the craziest reporting trips you've ever been on?
They're definitely way up there for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so besides the fact that scientists are seemingly absolutely crazy, what was like your biggest takeaway from these trips that you went on?
Yeah, I mean, it was a real privilege to join scientists in the field and be able to experience these very unique and different ecosystems in person. And I wanted the book to be, to feel as diverse as possible in its settings to kind of reflect the diversity of the planet at large.
Mhm.
So that's why I was seeking out these kind of extreme and very different from each other environments. But I also, wanted there to be something more relatable, not to have everything be so far flung and hard to access. So one of the chapters ended up being about my garden in Portland, Oregon.
Okay.
And that chapter, it focuses on the history of Earth's soils. And this is something I had to learn about when I was sort of trying to create a garden from scratch with my partner, because our soil was in really bad shape. And it was
Okay.
clear that we weren't going to be able to grow things very easily there. So I was trying to figure out what I could do to kind of revive the soil ecosystem. And that's when I discovered that, soil is a surprisingly recent phenomenon in Earth's history. What we think of as soil, like really soft, fertile, dark earth, has not really existed for that long because it is so tied up with complex life and really
Mm.
depends on complex life. So it begins with, weather breaking rock down into smaller pieces, which can happen without life. But that mostly creates crumbled rock, not really what we think of as organic soil.
Mhm.
And then life forms like moss and lichens and fungi come along and they further break apart that rock with acids and enzymes, and they start to enrich it with carbon and organic compounds. And that is really what defines, the kind of soil we depend on to grow things. And then animals and plants come in and further enrich things, and they permeate the soil with roots, and they create all these amazing channels. And it really becomes an ecosystem once you have life all bundled up with it. So textbooks and scientists are increasingly speaking of soil itself as a living system, right? Not
Mhm.
just a substrate or a medium in which things grow and live, but soil itself is this living, breathing entity that has to be continually maintained, just like any living system. And so when I learned that, I decided that the best thing I could do would be to bring in a bunch of healthy plants to this kind of denuded, barren soil, landscape we had in Portland. And they really, kickstarted this process of reviving the whole soil ecosystem. So they really get the credit for doing most of the work. And we went from having no wildlife at all, to having tons of birds and insects and raccoons and mice and
Oh,
even
wow.
birds of prey, coming
Wow.
through. So it's very, very different today. And it really astonished me what the plants and their kind of co-evolved symbiotic partners can do in a relatively short space of time.
Something that you had mentioned towards the end of the book was that this idea of every living thing is an ecosystem.
Mhm.
And that really made me think about us and the microbes that live inside of our bodies.
Mhm.
We are basically planets to those microbes the same way Earth is a planet to us. It sounds like soil is this living thing that's home to microbes the same way Earth is a planet to us. So I guess how did these ideas about living things as ecosystems once again blur the lines between life and the place that it lives?
That's a really good way to put it. I think you can almost think of life on Earth as Earth's microbiome, the way that like we as complex multicellular organisms, have these amazing microbiomes. Like there's all these tiny creatures living in us and on us and around us all the time.
Yeah.
And Earth is kind of similar in that way, where it is also this complex living entity that has tons of smaller organisms, crawling all over it all the time. And I think that analogy is sort of helpful for thinking about how can something be alive but also made of smaller living things. Well, it's like,
Mm.
well, that's actually true of humans and trees and whales and all, large complex organisms. So it's not that unusual, actually. It's kind of just how life and biology works. Life is permeating basically every layer of the planet we've been able to access. That's something else that really hit home for me, is that we used to think life was very much just on the surface and, in the surface layers of the ocean and just in the first few meters of the earth. And now we know it's all the way at the bottom of the ocean where we have vents. It's all the way up in the clouds, in the atmosphere. Basically, every part of the planet that we've been able to get to, we find life of some
Mm.
kind. And, probably there isn't life in the very middle of the planet where it's, or the internal parts that are just like liquid magma and such, or the molten metal core, whatever is down there. But, it definitely permeates a lot further than we thought it did even just a couple decades ago.
I do want to hear about life in the clouds. So you traveled so high up into the clouds on this journey in the Amazon rainforest. What exactly were the scientists studying there?
Mhm.
What did you learn about there?
Even just a few decades ago, we didn't think it was possible for life to exist in the atmosphere or in the clouds. But now we know that, tiny creatures like microbes are constantly being whisked up into the atmosphere, and they can actually survive in the clouds for at least weeks at a time, perhaps even feed and reproduce up there. And then they come back down to Earth in precipitation, in rain and snow and hail. So scientists have found microbes at the center of hailstones, in rainwater, in snow all over the world. And it turns out that some of these microbes, they're not just traveling between the sky and land, they're actually changing the weather as they do so.
Mm.
So there's one bacteria in particular that has these proteins on the surface of its cell that can turn liquid water into ice. So it encourages liquid water to freeze into crystal ice. And it basically, those proteins act as a template that kind of organize liquid water molecules into a solid ice crystal.
Okay.
And so these bacteria, they do this on the ground. They live, on plants and soil and water. We think maybe they do it on plants to sort of break apart plant tissues through frostbite and get access to them for food. But they seem to have evolved before plants existed on land. So it's become a little bit of a mystery as to why, they would have evolved that first. And some scientists think it's because they were encouraging ice crystals in clouds to form, to make those clouds bigger and heavier and more likely to burst so that the microbes would fall back to Earth sooner. So it's kind of a way for them, to get that return ticket, back to the surface of the planet.
Okay.
So now that this happens routinely, now they're constantly whisked up there, they speed up the water cycle, and they make certain types of precipitation more likely. So this is happening wherever there is land and plants. You're going to have these microbes. They're going to get whisked up into the atmosphere, and they're going to change the weather. So it's really happening all over the world. It's because a very important but understudied part of meteorology. How weather works on our planet.
So microbiology and meteorology are inherently tied.
Yes,
That's
exactly.
crazy.
Yeah.
So bacteria could be partially responsible for snow?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, most of the ski slopes and ski resorts around the world, they use those proteins derived from that bacteria to make artificial snow. So they combine those proteins with water and spray it into the frigid air, and that enhances the production of snow.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Wow. Tell me more about the microbes that you found on the opposite end, like mile down into the earth. What were they doing there? Why were they so significant?
It's still a little bit of a mystery exactly where life originated. The classic idea was that it happened on the surface in a warm little pond that had just the right kind of criteria and environment for life. But now the thinking is it could also have evolved or originated on the sea floor, where you have these hydrothermal vents that have sort of a lot of high temperatures and sort of freely available energy and interesting chemicals for life to work with. But it could have also potentially happened within the planet's warm, rocky interior, or it could have happened in multiple places in parallel. So we don't really know for sure yet. And some of these microbes that live way deep down in the Earth's rocky interior may most closely resemble some of the earliest microbes that ever evolved on the planet. They're not exactly the same, but they could have some features in common. And that's because, some of the earliest microbes were not the microbes that we're most familiar with. They were not performing, sunlight-driven photosynthesis. They were not decomposing animals and fungi and plants because those didn't exist yet. So they had to get energy in different ways. And that's what these intraterrestrial microbes, as they're known, are really good at. Yeah, it was just so bizarre to actually see them in person so far beneath the Earth, because I'd never seen anything quite like that. It reminded me a little bit of hot springs in Yellowstone, where microbes can form these really interesting prismatic colors and textures. But it was just, so far removed from anything happening on the surface. And down there were sections that were so stiflingly hot because we were so much closer to Earth's inner heat that you couldn't stay in those chambers, for more than a few minutes at a time, even though it was December, I think, and it was snowing and absolutely frozen on the planet's surface. So, very different worlds above and below.
So you have microbes making snow, and then you have microbes also living in some of the hottest places ever.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
crazy. Tell me more about these large mammals on the tundra. What was the goal there? What is the current status? It sounds like Jurassic Park. Was that intentional?
Yeah, the name, they call it Pleistocene Park, and that
Okay.
is sort of this winking reference to Jurassic Park. It's tied to this idea of the ecosystem engineer. So certain large animals and really sort of keystone animals are sometimes called ecosystem engineers because they so profoundly shape the landscapes or waterscapes they live in. And, modern elephants are a really good example. They're constantly scattering seeds. They're trampling and pulling trees down. They're digging water holes. They're fertilizing the grasslands with their dung. They're really changing things. And in fact, even a single elephant's footprint can fill up with something to like 50 to 60 gallons of water. And that becomes a temporary pond for all kinds of invertebrates and insects and amphibians. So elephants are just leaving new ecosystems in their wake just by walking across the savannah.
You had a beautiful line about this. I'd like to read the line. Simply by taking a step, an animal can remake the world and leave new worlds in its wake. That's stunning.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really astonished me when I learned that, especially because there's so many creatures that wouldn't have access to water or ponds otherwise. So they really depend on those elephants. And then I realized that that was probably happening with, mastodons and mammoths for millions of years before even modern elephants existed. So this kind of thing has really been going on for a really long time. And, the Zimovs, the Russian scientists in Siberia who run this experimental nature park, the elder Zimov, Sergei, he developed this really elaborate theory about grasslands and herbivores and how intimately connected they are, and how maybe it was humans hunting megafauna to extinction that kind of contributed to or exacerbated the warming that, resulted in the end of the shifting of those Pleistocene ecosystems and new ones taking their place. Because large creatures like mastodons and mammoths did something really interesting in the Pleistocene tundra. So similar to elephants in modern Africa, they're constantly, reshaping things and stripping things away just by being so huge and walking around. And one thing they do is by removing layers of snow, they're actually allowing colder temperatures to penetrate further into the permafrost and keep that soil frozen. So you'd think that removing snow would make things warmer, but actually snow can be very insulating and can trap layers of heat. Like that's kind of the idea behind an igloo, right? Is you make this like home out of snow, right? It holds in heat. So if you remove those insulating layers of snow, then you let that colder temperature get down there and keep things more frozen. So they were doing that, and they were also enhancing the fertility and the survival of grasslands in particular over trees and shrubs. And grasses are lighter in color, so they're more reflective. So they're actually reflecting more heat and light than darker colored trees. So they're also keeping the ground cooler. So the idea was that, by being so intimately tied to these grasslands, the giant herbivores are really preserving the entire Pleistocene landscape and keeping things cool. And so the Zimovs wanted to bring back that whole system. By bringing back the animals, they thought they could revive, all of those ecological interconnections.
Why is it important that we think about Earth as life and life as Earth? What significance does this have at large?
I think there's a profound philosophical difference between thinking of ourselves as merely inhabitants of the planet, or things that are clinging to this spaceship Earth, versus being literal extensions of the planet. So kind of like going back to that, microbiome planet idea, like we are alive ourselves, but we are part of a much larger living entity. And that's not this sort of woo-woo notion or a fantasy. That is scientific material truth. So to really embrace and accept that as scientific truth, I think is a profound shift that we really need right now, because it's so vital to understanding, what's going on with the planet today, because our species is the latest in a long history of life continually changing the planet. And sometimes life has changed things for the better and sometimes for the worse. But in general, when you give Earth and life enough time, they co-evolve and they find these rhythms with each other that kind of encourages both to persist and endure. That's what we see through deep time. But that's a very gradual process, and it often involves extreme upheavals. And the problem is that we have changed things so rapidly that there's no way that we're going to survive the tumult that would ensue if we keep doing business as usual. If we keep pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, keep changing the planet's surface in a way that really disrupts its ecology. So we have a choice. We can intervene, and change things in a way that we know how to prevent that kind of tumult and catastrophe from taking place. If we don't do that, it's going to happen, and the planet's going to recover on its own, through thousands to millions of years. But our civilization and way of life will not make it through that upheaval. So that's really why this kind of thinking and understanding is so important right now in our moment in time.
I almost hear you saying that just knowing that we are so vital to shaping the Earth, becoming Earth, we therefore also have the power to somewhat shape its trajectory
Mhm.
in terms of our own future. Would that
Mhm.
be fair to say?
Absolutely. I mean, we're definitely one of the most powerful species, individual species in the planet's history. There have been others before us, that have profoundly changed the planet, but no other living creature has changed so many different parts of the planet in such a short span of time. That's
Mm.
where we really stand out. So it's that combination of speed and scale. And it's now our responsibility to, change things for the better, not just for our species, but for all of the other creatures that inhabit this world, that are tied up in the ecosystems that we all share. And the choices we make literally right now in the next few decades will determine what type of planet Earth is going to be for at least thousands of years, if not longer. And that's another thing I realized writing this book is there really isn't just one planet Earth. There's actually been many different versions of Earth throughout the planet's 4.5 billion year history. Ancient 4 billion-year-old Earth is totally different from dinosaur era Earth, totally different from Earth today. And right now, Earth is in the process of changing again.
Mm.
If we don't intervene to preserve some, iteration, some version of the Earth that we've known and evolved in, it is going to radically shift and become something unlike anything we've experienced. So it is up to us to determine, which trajectory we go down.
Which trajectory should we go down?
Well, what scientists have been telling us for a long time is that we are pushing Earth into a new extreme hothouse state, as they call it. This is a state in which there's so much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that the planet's temperature really rises a lot by multiple degrees Celsius. The planet becomes a lot hotter. It becomes more tempestuous, stormier, more unpredictable, just a lot less hospitable in general. And so in that, potential future version of Earth, a lot of the ecosystems we have today, ranging from coral reefs to rainforests, to all kinds of fisheries in the ocean, all these things we depend on probably will not be able to exist anymore. That new climate won't be able to support them, which means our entire way of life, the kind of agriculture we depend on, the kind of cities we live in, they won't be sustainable either. And so what they're telling us is we need to, as rapidly as possible, shift away from greenhouse gases, which are the root cause of all of this, towards renewable and clean energy. And the biggest contributors to greenhouse gases are our current energy systems, so fossil fuels, and our current way of feeding ourselves, so industrial agriculture.
Mm.
So those are the two huge systems that have to change if we're going to really cut down, on greenhouse gases and prevent the rising temperature and all the horrible ecological consequences. And so if we do that fast enough, we can push Earth away from that hothouse state towards something that, while it won't be exactly the same as Earth that we've known until now, it will be livable, it will be survivable, it will be habitable, and it won't ruin billions of people's lives.
Hmm. You had written at one point that if we are thinking about Earth as alive, human beings are almost like the brain
Mhm.
of the Earth. So as the brain, what responsibility do you think we have towards shaping our planet in the future?
There are so many different kinds of intelligence on our planet, and there's so many fascinating, intelligent creatures that are aware of their environments and can respond to them in really sophisticated ways. But I do think our species is unique in the degree to which we were able to understand and model and study the world. There's no other animal or creature on this planet that builds supercomputers and models the entire Earth system, or at least attempts to. And so that puts us in a unique position because we can step back and see the system as a whole and see the interconnections. And so that gives us a unique privilege and simultaneously a unique responsibility. And so other creatures are absolutely tied to these planetary changes we've been discussing, but not in the same conscious way that we can be. We're the only ones that can step back and say, if we do this, this is where Earth is headed. If we do this, it might head in this other direction. Whereas all other creatures are participating in a less explicit, conscious way. And so I think we have to, acknowledge that and uphold that unique responsibility and make the right choices for ourselves, for humanity, but also for this incredible larger living entity that we're a part of, because it is truly miraculous when you think about it that all of this exists and has existed for billions of years. And it's just something that is way beyond too precious to waste, to not help endure.
I'm curious if you've thought about or come across in your reporting any ideas about humans role beyond Earth? So if we think about ourselves and Earth as the same,
Mhm.
what about ourselves and other
Mhm.
planets, and perhaps responsibility or morality tied up in shaping other
Mhm.
planets at some point in the future?
I think that if our species manages to survive into the really distant future, probably a lot further than we can, really conceive of
Yeah.
in any specific way, then getting to other planets and populating them in some way is a possibility. I think it's going to be extremely challenging. I just don't think we're anywhere near the sort of ecological or technological sophistication to do that.
Hmm.
And the novelist Kim Stanley Robinson has written about this and really beautifully in some of his work. And he's written that the distances between living planets, between habitable planets, is so great and is getting larger all the time because the universe is expanding. That first of all, it takes a huge amount of energy just to cross those distances. And then if you try to throw, Earth life onto another planet, it's going to have a really hard time taking because life is always an expression of its home world, of its
Mm.
innate planet. And so it's really difficult to get, one planet's ecology to just work all of a sudden on a completely different one. So I don't think it's impossible, but I think it's going to be extremely difficult. I think it's not, if it does happen, it won't be for a very, very long time. And my stance is that we have so much to take care of on our one, beautiful living world that we do have. And it just doesn't, to me, make sense to focus on that right now.
Hmm.
But it definitely is interesting to think about because I do think there are many other living planets out there that have their own evolutionary trajectories. Maybe some of them are a lot older than our planet. Maybe some of them have evolved other intelligent, even spacefaring, forms of life. But maybe they're so far away that we're just never going to cross those gaps and actually meet each other. But I also like to think that maybe there are special pockets of the universe where a couple living planets got really lucky and they're just about close enough that they can maybe like communicate through some like cosmic web chat or something, or like they can see each other or something like that.
Yeah.
We're not in one of those pockets as far
Yeah.
as we know, but maybe they're out there somewhere.
The Gaia hypothesis was highly contested when it was first introduced.
Hmm.
Now, in 2025, I'm curious what the reception has been like for your book
Hmm.
and the ideas presented in your book. We've come a long way since the Gaia hypothesis, so what has the reception been like?
Yeah, I was a bit nervous about how the scientific community might respond to a science writer proclaiming so boldly that Earth is alive, that we can, say that as a scientific fact. And we haven't so far experienced any backlash or criticism in that way. And I think that speaks to how far, as you're saying, that the thinking has come. Earth system science is very much a mainstream, fully well accepted field. It's not controversial at all. I think there probably is still some level of discomfort with certain scientists about saying, that Earth is alive versus simply saying that Earth is one big interconnected system. But I do in my interviews sense, an increasing comfort with that, increasing acceptance of that. And many of the scientists interviewed, for them, they're completely comfortable with saying Earth is alive. They say
Mm.
that's an explicit fact to them, that there's a difference between a planet that just has life on it versus a living planet, a planet that came to life like Earth, and they really favor, that latter way of thinking. So I do think there's been a lot of helpful, change in the way we sort of conceive of the planet as a living entity. And I'm also intrigued by the fact that there seems to be more and more books sort of circling similar subjects coming out from both science writers and scientists themselves, books that are really focused on the co-evolution of Earth and life and how each changes the other. Because even that was somewhat controversial not that long ago, and now is well accepted enough that we're seeing new waves of books really bringing it to the public's attention. Because all of this has kind of happened behind the scenes within, circles of science, and now it's kind of getting its spotlight for the public.
What sorts of questions or, future directions do you see this sort of line of thinking going, or this area of Earth systems research going?
Well, I do think it will continue to influence astrobiology and sort of the way we think about the cosmos at large. Because, if a planet can come to life, then it can die. So we could ask questions like, did our sibling planets, Mars and Venus, did they ever come to life at some point? And then did something go catastrophically wrong? Like, was there some sort of runaway a climate catastrophe that killed even all the microbes that once existed on those planets? Has that happened elsewhere in the cosmos? How common is it for a planet to come to life? How common is it for it to stay alive for billions of years as opposed to stuffing out, much earlier on? So, when you start to apply this framework, you really take it far in terms of the cosmic scale thinking. And I hope that it will give people more of a sense of agency and empowerment right now in the face of the climate crisis, which can be so daunting, because I do think it is powerful and heartening to see oneself as a living part of a larger living system that can influence, the system as a whole. Even if you're making just a small individual contribution, it's still adding up to something
Mm.
much bigger. Like just as an individual tree in the Amazon rainforest is part of a much larger living network that is changing weather across a whole continent and around the world, each of us is, one living individual that are part of much larger living societies that are changing, how the planet's climate and ecology and all of that works. And I really felt that with my garden in particular, because there was this small portion of the living earth that I had a little bit more say over and can kind of help, coordinate its evolution and its development and take it from a barren, just turf grass environment that is not, doesn't make much environmental sense, it's just a waste of resources, to a thriving wildlife friendly garden that's storing a lot more carbon and is contributing in some small way, to moving in the direction that we should be moving.
It's such an interesting point because I sense that there has been almost a shift away from placing all of the onus for helping the environment from the individual to thinking more about, large scale changes caused by corporations
Mm.
and things like that. Like, it used to be don't use your plastic straw.
Mhm.
Now it's kind of feeling like, okay, we could use the plastic straw.
Mhm.
But I sense that you're almost saying and thinking about ourselves as extensions of the planet, even those small changes actually do matter.
Yeah, I've always, with that type of thinking, like for me, it's always been both. I've never been able to separate them, because larger systems are made of smaller components and vice versa. It's like, how do you separate one from the other, right? So yeah, I think you're absolutely right that I think that larger systemic shifts are necessarily built upon smaller individual
Mm.
changes. And so I like to think about both of those things at the same time. And I think that really comes from this kind of science and holistic thinking, because it's all about connecting the microscopic to the macro, the cellular to the planetary. It's really about the connections between them. It's really about the
Yeah.
connections and relationships between things. That is what really endures through time. The individual species and ecosystems and all of that changes and shifts. But these really important relationships are what persist and define Earth, define a living planet as we understand it.
And thinking about the future of our planet, sometimes it can feel really, really daunting. It can be easy to think that it's kind of going to be a catastrophe. Do you feel optimistic or pessimistic about our ability to shape our planet in the future, the path that we're going to take?
A lot of the scientists I interviewed would toggle between a more optimistic and pessimistic frame of mind, which I completely empathize with. And I think it is difficult to be engaged with what's happening right now in the moment, politically, culturally, in terms of making progress on climate change, and not feel some level of, severe disappointment, pessimism, just feeling really disheartened about it all. But when you spend a lot of time looking at deep time and sort of Earth throughout its entire 4.5 billion year history and how things have really changed on those scales, you do develop an appreciation for a degree of tenacity and resilience that the planet has evolved. And I always come back to that point. We always have to remember that the Earth, our planet, has gone through incredible cataclysms and has always revived no matter what. And so I take some solace from that, like, I don't think we're in danger of losing Earth itself. I think regardless of what happens, this incredible planet is going to endure. The question really is, are we going to allow ourselves to be part of that enduring
Mm.
legacy, right? Are we going to preserve a version of Earth that supports us and allows us to continue our way of life? So that's really the question before us. So I think some people, they have the misperception that we're going to like literally destroy the entire planet and kill all life. And that's not really what the situation is. It's more about, preserving our version of Earth and helping us and humanity and all the ecosystems we're tied up with continue. Um, so yeah, I do find myself kind of bouncing around between, the positive and the negative, but I think writing this book has magnified my sort of innate awe for nature and for the planet more than anything, and that really keeps me going as well.
I wonder if you're perhaps asking, will we do what the dinosaurs did not do?
Yeah. Yeah, the poor dinosaurs, if only they could have seen what was coming. Yeah, I mean, I still believe that humanity has the knowledge and the capacity to do what needs to be done.
Mm.
We definitely know what needs to be done, and we definitely have the technology and skills to do it. So that is not the problem. What we're still kind of developing and waiting for is like the real cultural and political shift, that true inflection point that really changes things for the
Mm.
better in a really large and profound and meaningful way. And it's not to say there hasn't been progress, because there has been. We know that a few decades ago we were on a much worse trajectory, and we're not on that trajectory anymore. We're still nowhere near where we should be, and there's still so much to do. But it is true that we have made some progress, and we are seeing renewable clean energy become some of the most affordable type of energy around the world in many cases. And that's a really important shift as well, because that will really drive things forward in a very powerful way. So there are bright spots, amid the larger gloom, but it is true that we haven't made the kind of changes that need to happen at the scale or speed that need to happen. So that is still to come.
You mentioned that, like, one of your biggest takeaways from writing the book and doing all of this wonderful reporting is just this sense of awe.
Mm.
Was there a moment where you just felt completely struck by awe for our planet?
In smaller moments, in my garden, because when you're sort of on your knees in the living earth, you really pay attention in a way you don't at other times. You really kind of slow down, and you see the intricacies, of a single leaf, or, a single drop of water clinging to something, or these tiny micro animals that you never realized existed. And I've become really fond of the native bees that we have in North America, because I used to think there were just honeybees and bumblebees, that was it. And now I understand that there's, tens of thousands of different bee species around the world. And then many of them live in North America, and they include like glittering green, iridescent bees, and like fluffy giant orange bees, and shiny blue bees, and all kinds of different kinds I didn't realize were there. And for me, it just represents just how much, marvelous diversity and complexity is out there, but that is invisible to us most of the time.
Mm.
And it really takes this kind of science and knowledge and understanding to, pull the veil back and reveal all of that.
Ferris, thank you so much for being here. This was really wonderful.
Thank you for having me. It was great.